Dingiwala, hello again. We are going to kick off the next stage, Overland 250 Archive, Too Fast, Too Furious, with some videos. The first video is very, very excitingly from Lily Brett, who has recorded this all the way from New York. And this is, obviously it's pretty exciting. She'll be reading from her short story Miriam, which was published in 1988 in our 110th edition, which is actually at the back there if you would like to have a look at that. And then after that, we'll be hearing from Jordana Silverstein, who has written an archival response to Lily's short story. So please enjoy.
This is part of a short story called Miriam. I wrote this decades ago. Garth's new trousers had 3 pleats on either side of the zip. Until now he had worn skin-tight, peg-legged Levi's. Miriam looked at Garth. She found the loose space between his legs alluring. She started to think about what lay behind these parallel pleats. Not since Miriam was 17 had she felt lustful just looking at a man's crotch. Out of bed, Miriam rarely felt sexually aroused. She had enough trouble feeling that way in bed. Where were the children? Could they hear? Was she ovulating? Should she use Ultrasure with spermicidal cream or Nuda, natural feeling condoms? What was the time? Did she have to get up early in the morning? These were questions that occupied Miriam when sex seemed imminent. A distant memory flickered in Miriam's head. She quickly tried to calculate how old she would have been in the 1950s, when all men wore pleats in their pants. She had been still young enough to sit on her father's lap and crush him with hugs when he came home from work. Miriam had always adored her father. She still did. She couldn't resist his generosity and his sense of humour. She loved the way that he turned beetroot red and cried when he laughed. If he laughed at the dinner table, pieces of fish or chicken would fly from his mouth and land on the other side of the kitchen. Miriam's girlfriends also adored her father. Mr. Bloom, can you drive us to Luna Park? They would beseech him. On Saturdays and Sundays, Mr. Bloom could be seen driving through the streets of Melbourne, his pink Pontiac Parisienne full of chattering, gum-chewing 14-year-olds. If they passed Leo's Spaghetti Bar in Fitzroy Street, the girls knew that they could rely on Mr. Bloom to shout them to a round of chocolate gelati. Mr. Bloom loved gelati. Before the war in Lodz, Poland, Mr. Bloom used to spend more money a week on ice cream than most people earned. Mr. Bloom came from one of the wealthiest Jewish families in Lodz. They owned apartment blocks, knitting mills and a timber yard. Mr. Bloom, at 16, was in charge of the timber yard. He doubled the turnover, fiddled the books and pocketed the profit. Nobody noticed. Mr. Bloom met Mrs. Bloom when she was the very quiet, studious, extraordinarily beautiful Basha Rodham. Mr. and Mrs. Rodham, pious, hard-working, respected members of the Jewish community, lived in 2 small rooms with their 7 children. Mrs. Rodham paid the caretaker of their block a couple of zlotys extra a week to keep one of the external toilets solely for the use of the Rodham family. Basha was always grateful for this luxury. Green-eyed Basha's ambition was to study medicine. She was not easily deterred from her studies. Mr. Bloom wooed this red-haired, slim-hipped, serious 16-year-old fervently. He bought her the first pineapple she had ever seen, and peaches and strawberries. Just as Basha finished high school and was preparing to leave for the University of Brussels, Germany invaded Poland. All Jews living in Lodz were ordered to move to a slum area of the city. In this ghetto, they were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Mr. and Mrs. Rodham urged Basha to marry Mr. Bloom. They thought that she would be better off with his family. In their haste and confusion, the Bloom family had only been able to pack a few valuables. At the end of that first year in the ghetto, they were as poor and as hungry as everyone else. They had sold their last diamond, a blue-white 2.4 carat stone in heavy 18 carat gold setting, for a sack of potato peels. Potato peels were a luxury in the ghetto. You had to have good connections in the public kitchens to buy this delicacy. You also had to know whether the kitchen used knives or potato peelers. Peels from the kitchen that used potato peelers were mostly just thin films of dirt. Miriam hated hearing about the potato peels. It somehow seemed worse than the stories about children dying in the streets and relatives killing each other for a piece of bread, and trainload after trainload of people being shipped out of the ghetto, never to be heard of again. When Miriam was 12, she had boiled herself a pot of potato peels. She had often wondered what they tasted like. She was halfway through her first mouthful when Mrs. Bloom came home unexpectedly. Mrs. Bloom, who had never laid a hand on Miriam, took the bowl of potato peels, then screaming and crying, she shook Miriam by the hair until Miriam fainted. The thought of her father's penis made Miriam feel nauseous. If she thought about her father in sexual terms, she would have to think about him fucking her mother. She tried to blink that thought out of her head. Miriam used to be able to think thoughts out of her head. She would grit her teeth and blink hard 3 times, and the thought would disappear. Now, 3 years into an analysis, Miriam knew there was no magic in blinking. At 17, Miriam was having furtive sex regularly, if erratically, with her first serious boyfriend. One evening, with her puce-faced boyfriend hovering above her, Miriam was suddenly seized with the thought that maybe her parents were doing the same thing in their bedroom across the hallway. Her stomach heaved and she vomited and vomited. Fortunately, Miriam's boyfriend considered himself an existential eccentric. He felt that this messy, smelly, potentially humiliating episode merely added to the interesting experiences of his life. Melbourne is a small city. Years later, people still asked Miriam if it was true that she had chucked all over Johnny Rosenberg while he was fucking her. Garth looked like Mr. Bloom. He was pale-skinned and dark-haired with heavy-lidded large brown eyes. Garth, Miriam's second non-Jewish husband, at least looked Jewish. Miriam saw this as progress. Frank, her first husband, was 6'2" tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes, a perfect Aryan prototype. At 19, Miriam had ended her adolescent rebellion with a bang by marrying Frank. Australian men, Mrs. Bloom had told Miriam regularly, go to the pub every day after work. They don't come home until after the children are in bed. When they come home, they are not interested in what they eat. Probably they've eaten a pie in the pub. What sort of life would that be for you, Miriam? And then when it comes to the private things of life, an Australian husband will handle you very badly. They won't touch you gently. Thank you very much.